things that need solved.
Okay, we're back. You there? Hello? Okay, so we are back, and today we're going to talk a little bit about just what World War I was. Just some background, some history, and then we're going to, in the one of the other modules for today, talk about just some of the poetry that came out of World War I. There was some very good, both German and British poetry that came from soldiers on the front lines in World War I, most of whom died in the war, but managed to write some really good poems before they died. And that's really going to be one of the freshest experiences of combat that we see, because these poems tend not to be combat remembered. These are combat assets being experienced. These poems were sent home in letters to family members. So, Dr. McFall, why don't you start us off by explaining what this World War I thing was?
So this is a big deal right now, right? Because we're in the middle of the 100th year anniversary of the war, and so you've had this flood of books and movies and documentaries and TV shows, and you might have seen them even in your casual flipping through channels. The basic facts are pretty simple, right? This is a war that runs from 1914 to 1918. It's a war that is primarily fought on the European continent by European countries, but involves the rest of the world, both through the imperial systems, right, the British and the French empires that they use to get additional manpower, that they use to get additional material, and so on, and also through the economic interconnections of a globalized world, which means that every country has some stake in the war, whether it's economic or human, right? And so it lasts for 4 years, and in the end, it ends with a British and a French and American victory, with Germany and Austria-Hungary forming the Central Powers, having been soundly defeated, and with Russia, which started the war on the British side, having decayed or having fallen into revolution.
Nice. So who started the war?
Well, there's a big debate.
I remember in high school, I had a teacher who that was our high school question: who started World War I? And the right answer was Germany. And whatever you put that wasn't Germany, you just got wrong.
So one answer is Gavrilo Princip, who's this teenager, Serbian teenager, who's mad because part of what he sees as his country actually belongs to somebody else. And he decides he wants to make a statement to rally support for the idea that all Serbians should be united in one country, and the opportunity
for greater Serbia.
Yes, so there is actually an existing Serbia already, but there are Serbians living in other parts of other countries.
Isn't that kind of still going on?
It goes on. It's been going on for 150 years in various places. And so he takes a pistol, and he kills the representative of his enemy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their second in command, right? The guy who's going to be emperor after the current emperor dies. And so one answer is that a pistol shot starts the war, right? That's not a very satisfactory answer, though. It doesn't seem to make sense to people.
Is that the spark in the tinderbox?
That is, or it's the butterfly, to use a kind of a modern weather metaphor, it's the butterfly flapping over the Pacific that ends up in a hurricane in the Caribbean, right?
Okay.
And what has to happen then, of course, is that there has to be all of these pre-existing tensions that magnify this initial force and reflect it and refract it and multiply it until you get this global conflict, right? And those forces those pre-existing tensions are nationalism, right? Every country wants its own country to be the best. Those pre-existing tensions include an arms race. Expenses on arms across the continent doubled in the 2 years before the war. They include a kind of cultural sense of militarization, that the way to be a man was to be in the army, the way to be a hero was to be a soldier. And they include an economic competition for who's going to be richest.
So are we kind of going for who's going to be the big country in Europe?
Yes. The idea is that that there is a competition for power, and they actually compared it to evolution, where the biggest guy on the block, right, ended up succeeding, and the rest of them, at best, are the lackeys of the big guy, and at worst, just disappear.
And hasn't this been going on in Europe for quite a while?
It had been going on in Europe for probably 300 or 400 years, right? We don't think of it much today because Europe has been peaceful mostly for 70 years, but Europe is actually a very violent place for 400 years. The distinction here isn't one of the change doesn't have to do with the fact that these countries are at war. It has to do with how they fight the war.
Okay.
And that has to do with what we call the Industrial Revolution, which enabled both the production of new weapons like machine guns and rapid-fire artillery and airplanes, and has to do with how much of them they can actually produce. Right, the volume of weaponry is exponentially higher in the First World War than it was even in the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay. So
the next logical question might be, so what effect did all of these weapons have, right?
They killed a lot of people.
They killed a lot of people. So first of all, to tie this back to the kind of to the kind of readings that you're doing, right? The first thing to remember, if you're talking about the outbreak of the war, right, is that each side thinks that their side is justified. Right? So as you read the two novels you'll read about World War I, as you read the poems, one thing to remember is that all of these people see that or almost all of them, think they are fighting a just war. Right? So expectations matter. The second way expectations matter relate to the way the ordinary people thought this war would be fought. People who are generals, who are in the army, understand that this war is going to be different. Right? They're the people who deal on a day-to-day basis with the new weapons, with the new technology, with the recent past and how that technology has been used. Ordinary people like you and us, who maybe read about this in the newspapers, who read about it in scare stories or spy stories or military science fiction that show up in popular magazines, and there's a flood of this before the war. They don't really understand what these weapons are going to do. And so their expectations, the expectations they're going to bring with them to the conflict, and that they're going to shape their writing and the remembrance of the war, they think this war is going to be quick. Right? It's going to be bloody. That is true. It is going to be a war that their country wins. It is going to be a war where either they die and everybody remembers them having died a glorious death in a valorous cause and people will remember them and celebrate them, or they will come back and they will be celebrated as heroes, and they'll get all the girls, and they'll get all the good jobs, and their parents will celebrate them forever. Those are the options that people think they're going to have.
Can we read one of these poems?
Yeah. Please.
I think we got to read this poem by Rupert Brooke called "The Soldier." And if you should have this sheet that we posted. You look at the lifespans of all of these poets, you'll find that almost all of their lives ended between 1915 and 1918. Not a coincidence. And Rupert Brooke, I think, is probably the poet who dramatizes what Dr. McFall is talking about here. The idea that that war is a great time of challenges and testing, and you either die a glorious battle for your country, or you come home and you're the successful one. So Rupert Brooke, who died in 1915, says, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think this heart all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less. Give somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven." That sounds cool.
Yeah.
I want to go die in a war. Because, I would be taking Kansas with me.
Hmm.
And somewhere over there in Europe or Asia or the Philippines, wherever I die, that place would like be Kansas.
And
Awesome.
and death would be peaceful, right? There's no more competition, no more conflict, no more stress of daily life. Instead, you have, you know that your life was sacrificed in a worthy cause, and now the afterlife, whatever it is going to be good.
So my death meant something,
Yeah.
and therefore my life meant something. And what it meant is wrapped up with my country.
Yeah.
Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.
Mm-hmm. Which means?
It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country.
And notice the date on this one, right? Because we're going to talk in a little bit about that exact poem, which is dated a little bit later, right?
Yes.
But this one is, he dies in 1915, early in the war, where you can still reasonably think serious, to mean that kind of phrase seriously, without any irony, without any sarcasm, right? Because what's not here, remember, is the violence of the war itself, right? This poem has none of that in dramatic comparison to many of the other poems that we've got here and many of the other poems that are produced, which focus on the experience of war.
So is it fair to say that between 1915 and 1918, this shift that we're talking about, the sort of ideal view of war became a really horrific reality for most of the people who were there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now we should, one brief caveat, right? Because the experience of being wounded is always devastating, always painful for any individual person whenever it happens, right? But that said, most people who die or are wounded, who are writing home in 1914, early 1950, early in the war, when they think their sacrifice will be meaningful, view this as a war that is worth fighting, and therefore they are making a sacrifice. They're becoming something of a martyr to the national cause.
So what did the British soldiers and the German soldiers think that they were fighting for? I mean, what if I had asked Rupert Brooke, this young, probably 17, 18-year-old boy going off to die a death for a cause, what's the cause?
The cause is England. The sense of identity that goes along with the country that you are from, that wraps you up into a greater cause and into a larger group of people and gives your life meaning. Now, that's not all that's important, right? Because they do believe that each set of soldiers, primarily, especially early in the war, believes that the other side, if the other side wins, their country and therefore their family and their local community is going to endure some kind of catastrophe, right? And you look at the propaganda that's put out. Each side portrays the others as brutes who are going to rape your women and beat up your parents.
Can we get some pictures and cut those in post-production?
We can probably do that.
Okay. When you see this, there will be pictures post-production.
Indeed. And they will be pictures that are probably recognizable to you, right? Because the way images are used in propaganda hasn't really changed. The names of the people who are associated with those images change, but the kinds of images that are used in World War I persist.
But they're, a British person and a German person, I mean, that's the same block, historically speaking. That's like, that's like the person from Maze and the person from Goddard. How do they identify themselves to where that other person that is so similar to them is so different from them?
And what has happened over the previous 50 or 75 years is an intentional effort by a variety of intellectuals and politicians and writers to try and persuade each people that they are unique and they are special, right? And so it comes through in education where they're taught in schools that they are special. It comes through in poetry and folk tales and the kinds of stories or songs that your mom sings to you at 3 or 4. When you are 3 or 4, when they're trying desperately to get you to sleep, it comes through in the kind of festivals you see. It comes through in the kind of way they've used, especially sports, right? Sports like gymnastics, which become national sports in Central Europe. And it takes 75 years, and it seems nonsensical. But in fact, by 1914, most English people English, right? Not United Kingdom or Great Britain, because the Irish and maybe the Scots wouldn't have agreed with this. And most Germans each thought that their own particular nationality was supreme, right? Along with this goes a rise in a kind of scientific understanding of the world, right? Science contributes to this as well, because as people try and examine the natural world and try and understand the differences between species, the differences between the environments they see in, now they're exploring in Africa and Latin America, and they're trying to understand the difference between the environment and the animals they see in, the Sudan and South Africa. They start to apply those same kind of scientific principles and experimentation and classifications to peoples. Right? And so you get a scientific effort to classify people by race. And Germans and England, the Germans and the English, as part of the scientific effort, are distinguished.
Okay. Can you and let's just one more question, and then we'll end this segment and start the next segment. But this war begins when a Serbian shoots an Austro-Hungarian.
Yeah.
So how do France and Germany and England and Italy all get involved?
They get involved because they are part of a interlocking set of alliances that are created before the war, that are meant to be defensive means of protection, right? So that France will sign an alliance with Russia in order so that if Germany wants to invade France, they won't do it because they know that France also has a friend in Russia. Right?
Okay.
So let me say, as we make that broader point about alliance structures, that's kind of high politics and that's important. But as you read the novels you're going to read, especially the one coming up here next, right, the All Quiet on the Western Front, I want to make two basic points to you. One is that the way soldiers adapted to the demands of a battlefield with machine guns and rapid-fire artillery was to dig. Right? And so this is a war where if you just look across the landscape, you don't see people because they are underground. Right? And so they live underground in what are called trenches or blockhouses, big ditches, right? So big sophisticated ditches, but ditches. The entire time they're there. And this is a really miserable existence, right? They are constantly threatened. They're constantly threatened by the enemy's weapons, but they're constantly threatened by disease, and they're constantly threatened by their environment, whether it's the cold or the rain or the lice or whatever it might be, right? So this is a war that they might intellectually be fighting for nationalism or for glory, but in terms of its experience, it's boring or terrifying and enormously uncomfortable.
How many of the casualties of the war were disease and things that weren't even related to combat?
This is an interesting thing. It's for the first time in history, fewer than half of the casualties in the war are disease. It's still up in the 40-45% range.
Okay.
But medicine is coming along, right? The real difference here is artillery. And this is not the place to go into the technology or the tactical advances, but all you need to know is that this is a way of the implication of this is that people do not see what killed them. And the result is they feel a complete and utter lack of control over their lives. Right? It's really hard to be a hero when there's no possible action you can figure out how to take that will increase or decrease your chances of living.
Okay. All right. Well, we will be back in just a moment for the second part of this module, which will go deeper into some of this poetry. So see you soon.